I want to ask you about two things. One, first off, what is it that economists have to bring to the world? And then I'm not talking about congressional testimony. I'm saying I'm going to talk to people in the lay public and I'm going to say, you think like an economist. Mm-hmm. What is that you can teach people about thinking like an economist that they could use? Yeah. What has been your experience?
What has been shocking to me is how little economics pervades almost every other aspect of life. Take, for instance, businesses. So I've worked a lot with businesses, with really big, successful businesses, with the people at the top of those businesses. And they just plain, almost to a one, do not think like economists. And so what does it mean to think like an economist?
That's what I was going to ask.
Okay, so I think there's I really think of economics as being applied common sense. That's like 80% of economics. Now there's a set of things that aren't obvious in economics, but there's a really big, the most important things in economics are so obvious. Okay, I mentioned one already, which is incentives, right? That if you change a rule and people care about that rule, they're going to change their behavior in response to it. I mean, nothing could be more obvious. Everybody understands that at some level. And yet how many times, either in policy or in a business, do you see people just ignore that? I mean, I think one of the best examples of that is from our colleague John List's work about the Endangered Species Act. So part of the Endangered Species Act says that there has to be, I think it's a 1-year window for discussion and review once a species is like being mentioned as being endangered. So what does John find when he goes and looks at the data? Not surprisingly, people who are thinking about building, they build like maniacs in that year before because there's no restriction on what you can do. You know that in the future you're likely not be able to build, and so they destroy the habitat at the highest rate of all time in that 1-year window. Okay, so indeed the Endangered Species Act has been very effective at endangering species because it gives builders exactly the wrong incentives to build immediately, even faster than they would otherwise. Okay, and it's totally obvious to an economist once you think about it that that's got to be a problem. I mean, you think of healthcare, all of the cases where we don't take into account the incentives of the different players. So that's one thing about thinking like an economist. Okay, the other thing is just you got to think on money.
But also part of it is it's important to get that evidence out there too, because what I find a lot of times is you'll say, well, geez, isn't that an obvious implication? Oh, nobody will think of that. That won't really happen. That's blackboard thinking. That's people don't really behave that way. And what you're saying is, lo and behold, they actually really do behave. Time and time again, you find that people respond. And I can't tell you the number of cases I've come across like that. And people point to data that says they don't respond.
Yeah.
And often it's that they don't look at the data where the response actually is going to occur.
Yes.
And you do see people respond. So I think part of the message has to be, hey, this is what economics tells us. And by the way, this really does work.
Yeah.
This is how the world works.
Yeah. One of the things I've learned, so I know you want to talk later about what economics needs to learn from the world.
Yes.
But one thing I have learned from the world that I think economics could benefit a lot from is the power of storytelling. I think in economics, like if you use the word storytelling, people are like, oh, what, that's not we're scientists, we don't use stories. What I have learned is that a simple story, like so what I just told about the Endangered Species Act, that's just a story, right? But people respond to that. Regular people, I can talk about incentives all day long, I put it up in equations on the board, but that kind of story works. And I'll tell you another story about incentives, which really changed the way I think about incentives. Because as you said, oftentimes people say, well, maybe some person's going to take advantage of some loophole, but is it really going to happen? But when I was trying to potty train my 3-year-old daughter, my wife had completely failed. She had been potty trained, but then she had completely reverted. And I'm like, look, this is a simple economic problem. It's all about incentives. Okay, I knew what my daughter liked. She liked M&Ms. Okay, and so I just said to her, hey, sweetie, it's Amanda, every time you go on the potty, I'm going to give you M&Ms. Okay, and literally, she said, really? And I said, yeah. She said, okay, I'll go to the potty right now. She literally walked over to the potty, went to the bathroom, I gave her some M&Ms, and I'm like, let the economist solve the problem. So for the next 2 or 3 days, it was perfect. Not one accident. She would announce she had to go to the bathroom, I'd deliver her M&Ms, everything was great. On day 3, she said again, oh, I have to go to the bathroom. I said, okay. I followed her to the bathroom. She dribbled out like 2 drops. Okay, and so I gave her the M&Ms, and then not like 30 seconds later said, well, I have to go to the bathroom. I'm like, okay. She goes, she dribbles out 2 drops. 30 seconds later, she says, I have to go to the bathroom. It was a classic example of I had given her an incentive scheme, and she had managed, a 3-year-old, in 3 days had managed to understand my incentive scheme and to game it in such a way that she had such bladder control now that she could cut off the flow in order to double, triple, quadruple the amount of M&Ms she was going to get. And to me, that was really interesting because here I was, like a world-class economist. And within 3 days, I got outsmarted by a 3-year-old on what I thought was a pretty good incentive scheme. And I always keep that in the back of my mind. Like, if my 3-year-old can beat me in 3 days, how in the world, can the government that's trying to put out incredibly complex regulations about oil drilling not expect that an army of lawyers and high-paid consultants aren't going to undo and find the loopholes everywhere? So I think my basic rule is, in a world in which people care about something, you can be absolutely certain that they will get that through the force of like the market and other things, they will get the best for themselves. And so it's really, it really drives one of my guiding forces in thinking about policy or incentives in general, is that the more complex the situation, the more complex the world, the simpler the policy has to be. Because complex policies and complex world leave yourself open to gaming in ways you can't even imagine, where it's at least simple rules, you can start to think about the ways in which they'll be gamed.
I think the other side of it is, I don't think we should question so much whether you get what you pay for, but you better be careful about what you're paying for.
The problem with incentives isn't that they don't work, it's they actually work too well. And often people respond to incentives not in the way you hope they will, but in the way that most effectively takes advantage.
Yeah, I remember this when I used to coach youth sports, and you design these little games to play in practice. And the thing is, they had an objective, which wasn't really to win the game. You were hoping the game would induce them to practice a skill that would ultimately help them. And you had to keep changing the game because they would always figure out a way that they could do very well in the game, but it no longer corresponded to what you were trying to accomplish. And they were a little worse than your 3-year-old. Maybe they took more than 3 times to learn, but you found that those games would degenerate because it wasn't that they didn't respond to incentives. They were really good at responding to incentives. I was just not as good at designing incentives that got what I wanted.
It's amazing how effective, when people care about something, how they figure out, through accident, through experimentation, whatever, how to optimize. It's one of the basic, I think one of the basic principles of economics, going back to the idea of what economics brings to the world, is the idea that people optimize and that they change their behavior to figure out how to get what they want.